Every year we watched our special show. People think I had it rough growing up in the Canadian North. Yes, it was cold. Yes, I'd had roads blocked by wildlife. I'd been snowed in, had our water pipes frozen solid, and we once lost power for 4 days straight. But that's not what I remember when I think of my time growing up outside of Yellowknife. I think of the community. I grew up with 6 other families on an isolated street on the outskirts of town. We were a close-knit group. I always knew we were a bit different, in a way. We were immigrant families, but that never played a part of it. All I've ever known is Canada, and my family was adamant about keeping it that way. The only way I could tell we were different was that some of the people on that street had an unusual accent. My sister Mia and I went to school with the other kids. We celebrated the same holidays, cheered for the same teams, and ate the same dishes. There was only one thing we did differently, and no one even knew about it. Every year in March, all families on the street gathered at our place for what we called Big TV Night. My mom made snacks and Dad cooked up caribou steaks bought from the local hunters. Us kids got a whole bunch of candy, and we all gathered to play card games and board games. And since it was the 90s, most of us played Pokemon on our Game Boys. By the time Big TV Night started, most of us kids were out cold, sugar-crashed and overstimulated. I only saw the show a handful of times since it began just after midnight. I didn't see the appeal personally. There were no cartoons, just people talking. Debates, news, field reports, weather. It was pretty much the same thing we saw on TV every day, but with new colors and new people. Boring as hell. I remember this one time when all the adults huddled around the TV, looking distraught. I tugged on my dad's shirt, whispering to him, "What's wrong, Dad?" "It's just adult stuff," he sighed. "Don't worry." "Why are you watching this?" I groaned. "It's boring." He ruffled my hair and shooed off a persistent moth. "Because it's important," he said. "And sometimes you gotta do important things even if they're boring." I stayed up with the adults trying to watch the show. There was a news segment about a man in a diver's suit, and I didn't understand what was so interesting about it. I mean, he looked sort of tall, but that was about it. It was weird. I fell asleep against my dad's shoulder, and the next day I was out playing with my friends in the snow like nothing happened. Over the years, most of the families on that street moved away. We didn't really keep in touch. It was sad to lose my friends, but my parents were very comforting. They told me some had to get work in a new town. Others went to study abroad. A couple just wanted to live in the big city. My sister Mia and I ended up being the last kids on that street. It wasn't all bad though. I had plenty of friends at school. Despite all the others moving away, my parents had their own Big TV Night every year. But the celebration of it disappeared. There were no more snacks. No more guests. Most of the time they wouldn't even talk to me about it. I just noticed them lingering in the living room a little longer once per year as the atmosphere grew more somber. The last time we had a Big TV Night I was 16 years old. Mia was 14. She went to bed early since it was a school night. I had trouble sleeping, so I stayed up a little longer. Hanging out with your parents isn't exactly cool and fun, but there was something eerie about seeing them both so quiet and thoughtful. No quips, no dad jokes, nothing. Just 2 middle-aged people waiting in front of the screen. I watched them closely. How they turned to an unusual channel, watching the static slowly fold into a colorful picture. The video feed looked a bit dated, like it was an old recording. I remember a 70s-style news presenter talking out loud as I nodded on and off. While mostly known for his Hollywood success story, Gable geared up towards a political career when he ran for governor of California in 1953. a move brought on by pressure from his many conservative Republican contacts within the movie industry. I looked up from my seat. That didn't sound right. Beating Democratic candidate Pat Brown in a tight-knit race, the would-be president paved way for media personalities to have a long-term impact on the North American political landscape for decades to come. Mom looked over at me and smiled. "It's just a show, honey," she said. "It doesn't matter." I shook my head and closed my eyes. While I was too big for my dad to carry me upstairs, they made sure to wrap me in a blanket. By the time I woke up, the morning sun peeked in through the living room curtains and the TV was off. It might not seem like much, but that is one of my favorite memories of my parents. They were regular people for a while, not a mom and dad. It felt real. Like they took off their mask, but still remembered to tuck me in. The year I turned 18, I moved to Edmonton to pursue a degree in computer science. My sister moved in with me to a shared off-campus apartment. And the following year my parents died. It was a snowmobile accident. They crashed through the ice and the bodies could not be recovered. We had to have a funeral with empty caskets. I had to take care of Mia after that. We were left a substantial life insurance payout as well as an inheritance, but we didn't have any other family to rely on. It was just us against the world. Mia and I took a vote and decided neither of us could bring ourselves to go back home to Yellowknife, so we decided to sell off the house. Digging through our family belongings was the most difficult thing I've ever done. You can only cry so much. At some point something inside you just freezes and dies. But I finished my studies. I got a job installing and maintaining inventory systems. It doesn't sound flashy, but it involves a lot of travel and a lot of late-night calls. My sister pursued a political science career and got engaged to a guy from Ottawa named Manny. I want to tell you about something that happened not too long ago. A couple of people from my old school decided to reach out to me for a reunion dinner, and it got me thinking of my old neighbors. I tried looking them up, but couldn't find anything about them on social media. I talked to Mia about them too, but she couldn't find anything either. Got me thinking about the good old days. And it made me think of that night with my parents watching strange late-night TV. I went to the reunion. I had drinks, talked to people, watched old videos, and got to hear from our childhood teachers. It was a massive nostalgia kick as expected. Having cocktails in our rundown school cafeteria was surreal. Slightly drunk and melancholic, I took a walk around town. I ended up on our old street watching the house from afar. I wondered what my life would have been like if my parents were still around. What would my mom have to say about Mia's fiancé? What would Dad say about my career? It hurt my heart to think about, but it stuck with me. I decided I would make an effort to reconnect with that part of my life, and to remind myself of what used to make life so worth living. Coming back home, I did some research. I couldn't find anything about the strange TV channel. Asking around on a couple of forums, people suggested it was a satellite channel. That'd explain why it could only be seen at a particular time, especially if it was a foreign satellite. I tried to tell them about the one show I remember watching on that channel, a mockumentary about President Gable, but people thought I was trolling. I talked to some engineers at work too. They suggested that I get an old CRT TV and a satellite dish. If I hooked that up and scanned the channel range around the right time, I might get something. It wasn't hard to get a hold of. We even had some spare stuff back in company storage. Bringing that equipment out to my car was a nuisance. There was so much dust that I couldn't see the color of the sun-faded plastic. I reached out to Mia about setting up a big TV night of our own. She was all in. We rented a weekend place not too far from our old street. Mia brought her fiancé along, and we tried to make it a bit of a celebration. We decided to make a weekend of it, going ice fishing, making our way around town, that kind of thing. It was shaping up pretty nicely. So we got there, and while Mia and her man loaded in their things, I got started on the TV setup. The satellite dish was a bit smaller than the one we used back in the day, but I figured it might still work. So I set it all up, checked the channel scan function, and got ready. The show always started around midnight, so we had plenty of time. We played a couple of games. Things got a bit out of hand when Mia suggested turning Go Fish into a drinking game. Let's just say she had to go to bed early. I ended up sitting downstairs with Manny. Honestly, I almost forgot about the TV. We were busy talking about what we were gonna do the next day. We'd both had too much to drink, and I had some trouble finding the channel as Manny rambled on and on about his upcoming bachelor party. It was just past 1:20 a.m. when the scanner suddenly stopped. Manny was asleep on the couch. I was sitting on the floor, manually changing the settings with little black click buttons on the front of the TV. The CRT came to life, showing the tail end of a show. Some kind of nature documentary with an Attenborough-ish sort of narrator. In Singapore, the moth has long been rumored to be the spirit of those long since passed, coming back to visit the living. Looking at the hawk moth, one can see the faint resemblance of a skull as Dash. I didn't get it. It was just a nature show. I laughed a little at all the effort I'd put in. Maybe this channel was just a funny quirk of the local area. Maybe there was no greater meaning. I fetched the last quarter of a bottle of mint schnapps and plopped back down on the floor. Manny had already lumbered upstairs and called it a night by then, leaving me to watch the show on my own. I decided to keep the drinking game running. Every time the guy mentioned a new country or used the word century, I took a swig. I finished the bottle in 20 minutes. The reception got bad at around 2 a.m. By then I was barely aware of what country I was in. The TV was laced with static as the show came to a close. I was rolling the bottle back and forth on the floor as if trying to play spin the bottle with myself. The narrator continued. In the summer of the first ruptures, back in the early 20th century, the moths were among the first to pass beyond the restrictions of our common space, he said. Much like the canaries of our coal mines or cancer-sniffing canines, these faithful companions have been a guiding star to keep those who brave the unknown in search of a better tomorrow. That made me perk up. What the hell was he talking about? The screen was growing worse and worse. I smacked it on the side, almost dislodging the satellite dish connection cable. I fumbled around a little, pushing it back in its socket. The narrator returned mid-sentence. Our best efforts. Thousands continue to disappear from our communities as unstable ruptures grow year after year. And even then, those lucky to return seldom do so unharmed. But with friends like the Ian Moth, our brave Dash. The screen was showing a group of armed soldiers standing outside a large white door. I'd never seen anything like it. A round door split in two half circles with golden knobs. The soldiers parted ways as something massive entered the screen. The feed was barely holding on. Volunteers, desperately, to a mind, body, and soul dash. I'd seen it before. The show with the diver from when I was small. A 2.5-meter tall person with gangly arms that reached past their knees. That's about 8 feet. Their skin covered in a black plastic like a dry glue. It towered over the armed personnel. Will lose themselves, risk it all, true patriots of Dash. The feed cut out. The room filled with a deafening static, leaving me sitting there in front of the screen like a living question mark. I was drunk, confused, and frightened. Much like the story of President Gable, this show was telling something I'd never heard. The outline of the dark figure faded from the screen, broken apart by dithering dots. I tried switching the channels to find the signal again. I tried a lot of things, but it just didn't work. It was lost, and I was too drunk to figure anything else out. So I turned the TV off and sat there in the dark, brushing my fingertips against the grain of the wooden floor, as a moth fluttered by the windowsill. There wasn't much to say. I woke up the next day with a schnapps-tainted punishment hanging over the back of my head. We skipped ice fishing and went straight for junk food. It turned into a slow and pleasant weekend overall, but the thought of that strange show stayed on my mind the whole time. I tried to explain it to Mia, but she didn't understand what was so fascinating about it. So I watched a weird nature documentary, Drunker Than a Skunk. So what? I didn't make a big deal out of it at first. On our way back to Edmonton, I read a couple of articles on moths, but I couldn't find anything about an Ian moth as mentioned in the show. I couldn't make heads or tails of it, so I figured I might have misremembered something. Manny was behind the wheel, so Mia leaned over to check what I was reading. She sighed and rolled her eyes. Ugh, I hate moths. I don't mind them, I said. I used to get them all the time, she continued. They were all over the floor. No, they weren't. Yes, they were. You didn't notice, you slept upstairs. I was downstairs all the time, I said. She rolled back into her seat, leaving me with my article. Not the last 2 years or so. You were busy being an angsty teen stuck in your room. Point taken. For the next year, TV night became a sort of hobby project of mine. Whenever I had an evening to myself or wanted to get away from my thoughts for a while, I turned to my project. I did notice a couple of things. For example, the TV show always occurred on a full moon, during something called the worm moon, where earthworms first appear in the northern hemisphere. It also seemed to have to do with the location itself. I asked a couple of acquaintances in the area to see if they could tune in around that time in nearby locations, but they couldn't. By process of elimination, I could narrow down the window of opportunity significantly. Turns out, the only place we could get a signal was that particular town, on that particular night. Meaning it wasn't a matter of just Earth's position. It was Earth's position in relation to a foreign object. I talked to Mia a couple of times about going there again the following year, but she wasn't interested. She and Manny were settling down to plan a family, and they were having their wedding in May. She couldn't afford to go off on another drunken nostalgia trip with her older brother, so she decided to pass. So I had to do it on my own. I figured maybe I could go mobile, using a van and maybe a radio. Maybe there were more signals to pick up on. So I prepped a kit to install in the back of my car along with backup batteries, signal tuners, and a whole bunch of safeguards. I was also ready to record the whole thing to show the internet that I wasn't crazy. Then again, I was the one hooking up old CRT TVs to a chunk of plywood in the back of my Honda, so I wasn't making a great case for myself. But one question lingered with me all year. Why was this particular show so interesting to my parents? Maybe that show was the reason they moved so far up north to begin with. A full year passed. Celebrations, birthdays. Spring to summer to autumn and winter. New Year's Eve, after work outings, movie nights, car trouble, and taxes. But in the back of it all was that project of mine, waiting for just the right time. And although I'd be alone, I was more ready than ever. I'd taken a couple of days off work and I went back up north. I had everything set up in the back seat with a detachable panel so I could get some sleep if I wanted. 2 TVs with serial-linked car batteries and 2 portable long-range radios. I had some recording equipment, a spare GoPro, and not a drop of schnapps as far as the eye could see. And with that I set out for the far north. I called Mia to tell her where I was going, and that was that. She wasn't impressed. It's about a 15-hour drive, but I was ready. I had snacks, planned stops, audiobooks, and a clear timeline. It was kind of nice to get away from everything for a while. A lot can be said about the Canadian countryside and its endless snowscapes, but there's a peace to it. If you're not used to it, the cold can feel oppressive, but for those who've lived it, there's a particular feeling in the air that doesn't exist anywhere else. There's almost a taste to it. You can feel that you're going home. By the time I got to Yellowknife, it was late in the evening. I'd booked a room and my back was so stiff that I could barely feel my legs. The optimism and adventurous spirit had run out of me somewhere along Alexandra Falls, but at least I'd made it. Having someone to travel with and to take turns behind the wheel really makes all the difference. One parking, one stretch, and a pair of keys later, and I was face down into a soft pillow. Next night would be a long one, so I had to rest up while I could. The next day was all about prep and experimentation. I set up my equipment in the back of the car, tested it, and made some last-minute adjustments. I spent some time driving around town, looking to see if I could get an inkling of a signal early, but it was a no-go. I got a few concerned looks as I passed certain streets for the third and fourth time. I had a nice dinner at a local restaurant, a long shower, and got back on the road in the evening. I got myself a full tank of gas and layered up with plenty of clothes. It looked like a rough night as the wind picked up, crystallizing the tip of my nose the moment I stepped outside the car. Weather was the one thing I couldn't account for, and I didn't know how strong the signal would be. Could a cloud cover ruin this whole thing? I checked and double-checked all batteries, including my phone and GoPro. I was as ready as I'd ever be. By 11 p.m. I was parked on my old street, with all systems running on full blast. Recordings were prepped and ready. I was going to do a short drive test, east to west, then north to south, to see if I could prolong the signal by following it. I was going to do it slowly, but just getting a trajectory might help me identify where it came from to begin with. It was just a couple of minutes to midnight. My leg kept doing that shaking thing, and my mouth felt dry despite chugging a ginger ale only minutes earlier. This was it. There was a thump of anticipation in my chest as time slowed to a halt. There was something special about today. I could feel it. Maybe I'd get some answers. If not, I didn't know if I could keep it up for another year. This'd already been a huge time sink as is. But as the electronics slowly rumbled to life, it was all worth it. Both screens turned from static to a dark background, and to my surprise, the long-range radios picked up on something too. The same broadcast, but just the audio. I hit record on everything and started the direction check with my car as I listened and watched. It only took me a couple of minutes to realize the signal was moving from southwest to northeast. There weren't a lot of roads out there, but I'd follow for as long as I could. I found a slow pace I was comfortable with, turned the rearview mirror, and watched the segment that came on. There was a man in a TV studio with a black, neutral background. He was wearing these large square glasses to match his equally square jawline. It looked to be some kind of recorded special broadcast, at least 20, maybe 30 years old. He had no notes and looked straight ahead. The angle was a bit off, something a cameraman would have noticed. The man began to speak. On a night such as this, it's difficult to remain positive, he said. As the number of missing people continue to rise, we are getting continuous reports from large swathes of the American Midwest. The man took off his large glasses and slowly folded them into his pocket. Containment efforts have failed. Retrieval efforts have failed. 6 members of our broadcast team haven't reported in from their excursion to Cedar Rapids, and we fear the worst. I took a right turn and stepped on the brakes, gently. I leaned back to turn up the volume a bit, to make sure no syllables were lost over the puttering engine. The wind had picked up and struggled against the hood of the car, howling in anger. Our allies across the Atlantic are fleeing large population centers as evacuations backfire, with desperate, inhuman efforts on full display. To the south, the border is closed and armed forces exchange live fire in panicked skirmishes. Our neighbors to the north are repurposing quarries and mines into temporary shelters to wait out an endless storm. There was a shake to his hand and a tremble to his voice. There were no visual effects on the screen. No channel number in the corner. No subtitles or name tags. Just a long serial number at the bottom of the screen, as if what was being shown was some kind of unedited footage. There is no leadership to turn the tide. There are no scientists with grand ideas. As our world cracks like the shell of an egg, we bear witness to a rapture unlike anything we've been promised. As our clocks turn the wrong way. As our sons and daughters lose themselves in a land of in-between. As our dash. The feed stuttered. I stepped on the gas to compensate. The weather was getting worse and it was interfering with the feed. I had to keep up just to get a clear radio signal. The video was breaking up. There's nowhere to run, the man continued. There's nowhere safe. We know what happens to those who flee. To those who step beyond the boundaries. I swallowed. I turned on the windshield wipers, noticing how their rhythm matched my pounding heart. My hands grew cold with sweat inside my woolly mittens as I gripped the steering wheel. No greener grass across the fence. There's nothing to keep us from ruining ourselves but God. And God has waited long enough. God has grown tired of waiting, so he calls us home not with trumpets, but horror. A horror of sin manifest and the culling of the cross. With a dash. I wanted to slow down and listen, but I couldn't. Easing up on the gas made the signal weaker, so I had to keep up. I took a hard right, almost spinning out of control. I brought the car back to heel and kept going northeast. There was no one on the road at this time of night. The man ranted and raved, dissolving into a sobbing puddle. I could only see the outlines of his movement on the screen. He bawled and screamed, leaving a pool of snot on the table as he looked back up, steeling himself with balled fists. There can never be an ending to an ending, he cried. And in the grand scale of things we have proven nothing. The sun will set and the sunflowers will bloom in the dark. But will they remain blue if no one is there to see? I managed to pick up on a trail going more straight northeast, and the signal improved. There was a gap in the clouds, allowing a sliver of signal to come through. I saw the video feed in the rearview mirror as it bounced back. The man was walking up to the camera, coughing. Something fluttered out of his mouth. He collapsed into a coughing fit, but there was no one to turn off the recording. He kept looking back and forth between the camera and someone off to the side, but no one came to help. The camera just kept rolling. Moths fluttered out of him as a black gel erupted from his nose, mouth, and eyes. Little wings fluttered around the studio as he gargled in pain. His joints bending at unnatural angles. The colors of the recording seemed to shift, casting phantom images of him doing 3 things at once in different spectrums. Elongated limbs. A broken jaw. Fingers protruding like eye stalks of a snail. His bones were breaking. Extending. Changing. I turned back for a second to increase the volume a little more, to see if I could catch something in the background. Turning my attention back to the road, something poked my eye. Something small and fluttering. I stepped on the brake, sending me careening straight into a snow-covered tree by the side of the road. The full stop sent me reeling forward. All my equipment came loose and joined me in the front seat as the airbag deployed, smacking me into a whiplash. For a few seconds, all I could hear was screaming coming from one of the long-range radios, and the pitter-patter of wings struggling against the windshield. I looked up to see a moth trying to reach the headlights. My right hand fumbled around only to catch the edge of the seatbelt. I undid it and felt the handle to one of my portable radios. I grabbed it and rolled out of the car. The signal was getting weaker. There was an awful choking sound coming from my car as the engine struggled. A hissing voice came through before the signal rolled out of bounds. "No one leaves," a man said. "We will find you." The static increased. "We will find you." The broadcast cut to a repeating signal. Some kind of code looping in a pattern. One of the car batteries from my recording rig lit up from a short circuit, and within seconds the car was on fire. I dropped the radio to call for help, but realized I'd left my cell phone to charge in the front seat. It was all going up in flames. I didn't even care about the car. I was losing proof. I was losing everything. I barely noticed the moths at first. There were dozens of them fleeing the car. But they didn't leave, they loved the light. Instead they danced around the flames, casting stark shadows like inverse stars. But I had to leave. To get help. I barely even knew where I was, I just kept going and going and going. But there was only one road to follow, so I couldn't be all that far off. As the repeated signal stopped, I dropped the radio by the side of the road. It was just me in the cold. I could feel my teeth chatter, but I couldn't tell if it was from my racing pulse or the temperature. Maybe both. Or neither. Even there and then, I had to wipe moths out of my clothes. They seemed to appear out of nowhere. One of them crawled out of my beanie cap, getting its wings stuck to my sweaty neck. I could feel them moving. I could hear them all around me. And there were more and more of them. Then it stopped. There was a loud groan, as if the howling wind turned from a flute to a tuba. I could feel a ripple in the air, almost knocking me off my feet. A pulse growing faster. There was a pressure in my ears that came and went with a pop, sending a spike of pain up through my jaw and into the back of my ear. As the moths disappeared, I turned around, to see that I was not alone. There was something on the opposite side of the road. It was dark, but didn't reflect any light from the burning car. I could only see the outlines as a void, a black hole in the vague shape of a human. An elongated, broken human. I thought it was far off at first, but it was a matter of false perspective. It was much closer than I thought, and almost 3 meters 10 feet tall. It turned my way and moved. I was used to this environment. Thankfully it wasn't. As it moved towards me, I realized I would have no chance to outpace it in a straight line, so I headed into the woods. I weaved in between trees as knee-deep snow tried to trap me. But I knew where to step to not sink, to avoid bushes and dry saplings. To keep moving and to keep my head and center of gravity low. The thing was a mess. I heard it stumble as it struggled with every step. It was like watching a reindeer on ice, taking its first steps as it learned its limitations. It braced itself against every tree and branch as it threw and dragged itself forward with complete abandon, silently reaching for me. I was faster in so many ways. I'd been running through forests since I was a kid. But even then, there was no stopping the hapless onslaught of this half-shaped thing. The tree suddenly stopped, and I fumbled out onto a wide-open field. It took me a moment to realize I was actually on a frozen lake. The cloud cover had opened a little, basking the treeline with a gray full moon. Even then, I could barely see that thing. It seemed hesitant as it stepped onto the ice. It must have been heavier than I thought, as I could hear a loud crack, a noise that seemed to surprise the both of us. As it regained its footing, I heard it speed up. As it did, I had no choice but to run. And the faster it got, the less time I had to care where I put my feet. I don't know how long I ran, or what went through my mind. Looking back at it feels like a nightmare. The details get fuzzy, you just get these sprinkles of memory. My lungs burning from the cold air. The pooling sweat in my shoes. The whisk of a cold wind against my left hand, exposed to the elements. I must have lost my mitten somewhere along the way. But it gained on me. It towered above me. And as the man on the radio had prophesied, it had found me. It leapt, bringing down all its weight on me and the ice. Now, I don't know if it was the immense weight of this thing or cracks from the many ice fishing tourists, but we didn't just go down. We went straight into the frozen lake. For a second it was warm, silent. I was moving, but I couldn't tell if it was from being dragged down or swept by a current. Something grazed against my leg, but I could barely feel it. There was a pull as something heavy sunk. I've never been close to drowning or freezing to death. I haven't lived that life. But that night I could feel both at the same time. Your body doesn't know what to do. You don't have a natural response to this kind of shock. It's like a switch in you that just turns off as all fight or flight responses cease to function. For a moment I just bobbed around. Something moved underneath, sinking deeper. And I remember one thought coming to mind. I wondered if my parents had thought the same thing. Dying is easy. Mom and Dad were never scared. Maybe they knew something would be coming for them. Hell, they might have known they'd end up dead in a lake or worse. But maybe knowing the end to the story isn't reason enough not to tell it. They'd held the truth from us for better or worse, but in the wake of their deceit we found warmth. Falling asleep on my dad's shoulder. Having my mom tuck me in after a long night. No matter where they would go, those moments would remain. I'll never deserve the luck of having a tourist family seeing the ice break from their cabin. Of being pulled out by the neck. Of having a retired nurse perform CPR as the locals flocked out and forced to help from every corner. I just remember my eyes having frozen shut, and my lips painlessly cracking as I tried to speak. But deserving or not, my life was saved that night. The repeated pattern I'd heard on the radio had burned into my mind. I sketched it out on a notepad in the hospital as a Morse code. Before Mia came to see me, I'd interpreted the message and come up with a theory. Archive 93 Auto, it said. It wasn't playing a live broadcast. It was playing some kind of archive video. Most probably a fast-moving satellite. I think my mother and father came from somewhere else. Some strange, nightmarish place. The broadcast talked about sheltering in the mines. Yellowknife has a history of those. Maybe the other families came from a strange place as well. Maybe they all settled down in front of their TVs on the one day a year where a signal from home could make it through. I think that thing found my parents. It doesn't like those who cross from that place to ours. And even though my parents made a life for themselves here, I think it got to them in the end. I don't think they just crashed a snowmobile through the ice. I think there is a good reason why their bodies were never recovered. I think they were taken away, and I think that's what almost happened to me. I don't know the rules. I don't know if it came for me because I listened too closely, or because I was born somewhere else. Maybe I wasn't, or maybe I was. I have no one to ask, and I can never know for sure. When my sister finally arrived at the hospital, I hadn't decided on what to tell her. but she flung her arms around me, crying onto my shoulder. I could feel that it wasn't anger or disappointment. It was just relief. "Please," she cried. "Please be done." And with that, I made up my mind. "Yeah," I wheezed. "I'm done." It's been some time since then, and I've recovered in full. I've stopped listening. I've stopped looking for answers in the stars. I only write this to remind myself that it ever happened before I delete my account forever. I have no need to keep in touch with the AV geeks anymore. I'm done. But I'd be ignorant if I said I wasn't bothered. With every flutter of a moth's wing comes a question. Are they still looking to bring me home?